How's it going, everybody? My name's Dave Whipple and you're watching Bush Radical. Brooke and I are at our remote property in the wilderness of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We're setting up the wall tent for the summer. We hopefully would like to get a cabin built by the time the snow flies. But right now, we need to build an outhouse. If you got a remote property, a farmstead, a cabin in the woods, and you want to build an outhouse, and you're not exactly sure the way you should go about it, I'm going to show you guys one way to do it. So grab a newspaper, pour yourself a cup of black coffee, eat a bean burrito, and hang on tight, because we're going to build us a crapper. Back here in the distance, you can see the wall tent. We're probably 45 feet away. I think this is our spot. Digging the hole. That's always the hard part. Especially in ground like this that's basically in the woods. Tree roots and plant roots. And the first couple feet are always the hardest. Once you've got through that first few feet, you could probably expect to get into sand that doesn't have any roots. But right now, it's all about getting through that top layer. Once we get through the top, where all the roots are, you can see that this ground is good, clean sand. The one thing that really matters when you're digging an outhouse is you need to dig in an area that you've got good drainage, whether that's sand or whether that's gravel. You can't dig an outhouse in solid clay. It's going to fill up just like a little pond, even from just rainwater. You need a good drainable soil. I don't know about you, but I've always found it really satisfying to dig holes. You know, a tool that's as simple as a shovel, you don't really think about it much. But if you got the time and you got the inclination, you can do a lot with a shovel. Here's Brooke in the outhouse hole. One of the very, very last times you want to be down in the hole of the outhouse. After today, it'll kind of be a no-go zone, sort of.
I about can't get this out anymore.
There's the final product. About 5 feet deep. After you've got your hole in the ground, you're going to need two big heavy beams. That's what we're going to use to build the actual outhouse off of. The beams straddle the hole, and then you plank up one end of the beams, and on the other end you build the actual outhouse itself. So let's drop a couple trees. So that's perfect. I've got two sections of trunk. I'm going to measure them out to about 8 feet. That's about what you want, about an 8-foot piece. I'm going to cut them off. We'll use them in a minute. Now where these two trees were was right here, and it was blocking all this blue sky, and it was blocking this great big white pine that's right there. Now I have no use for logs. What I really need is 2 beams. I need 2 beams that are at least flat all the way down one side. And then I need a 90-degree flat section on the other side. The idea is you need the flat of a beam to nail your floor down to. And then you're going to have the sides of the beam flat so that you can nail your plywood to it. Now I don't need a true beam that has 4 flat sides, but I need one side flat and I need a section of another side to be flat. You'll get the idea. This would be a fantastic place to use a beam jig that you bolt to a chainsaw bar. I have one in Alaska that I've used to build an entire cabin, but I don't have it here in the Upper Peninsula with me. So that 2x4 that I'm placing on top of the logs, I'm using it as a guide. I run the bar of the chainsaw about a 1/4 inch off of the 2x4, and I'm doing this completely by sight. So that 2x4 sure does a good job in helping you keep cutting in a straight line. Gives you a good guide to use. Okay, this one goes on this side. And there's the 2 beams that are going to be the foundation for our outhouse. Now this outhouse is a very simple design. It's got a single pitch to the roof. The front of the outhouse where the door is 7 feet tall. The back of the outhouse is 6 feet tall. The 2 sides taper from 7 foot to 6 foot at the top. And then I generally cut them about 4 inches long, so it'd be about 7'4" on the high side and 6'4" on the low side. That way it gives you 4 inches of plywood to screw to your beam. You're going to see that in just a second. Right now what I'm doing is I'm cutting the doorway out of the front piece of plywood. This is a very, very simple way to build an outhouse. Just a couple framing members to it, which are 2x2s screwed at the corners. I'm just going to use the plywood for the door. You can get quite fancy building an outhouse, but there's no need to. You're not going to be doing much in there. You're kind of in and out. Here I'm throwing a little piece of scrap underneath the bottom just to hold up the door portion a little bit. And I'm going to cut a few inches off the bottom of that door. That'll just help it open and close without hanging up along the bottom. I like to run my skill saw almost to the corner, but I don't want those cuts overlapping and going deeper than they need to go. So I like to finish all the cuts up with a handsaw. Get a nice sharp corner. And there in the background you can see my doorway and my plywood door. Now what I'm doing here is I'm putting 2 sheets of plywood together, making sure that they're flush up on the corners, that everything's nice and even. And I'm going to cut the sides of the outhouse. Like I mentioned before, these sides are going to be 7'4" on the high side and 6'4" on the low side. I just need a little extra on the bottom so that I can lap over the edge of my beam and screw the bottom of that plywood to the beam. Now you might have noticed that I've cut a few things 45 inches, like the doorway, that was cut down from 48 inches to 45 inches. The reason being is that the roofing metal, or in this case, the clear plastic roofing, it comes 24 inches wide. That's considering the overlap. You get 24 inches out of each sheet. It's like 25 and a half. So it's going to be roughly 48 inches when it's put on top of the roof. And I want the outhouse just a little bit smaller. So I've got just a little bit of a roof plastic overhang on both sides. Now let's start putting the outhouse together. This is very simple construction method. I'm overlapping the plywood 4 inches onto the side of my beam. That flat section that was about 4 feet long that I cut onto the side of the beam. And I'm just going to tilt it up, kick a little bit of dirt up underneath the log to hold everything upright, and then I'm going to move on to the other side. Now I've built about 4 outhouses using this method, where you have 2 large beams that straddle the hole, and then you basically just put a light building and affix it to the beams. One of the beautiful things about building like this is with just a few screws you can unscrew the building from the heavy beams and move it right out of the way, and then take the heavy beams and then move them to another site in the event that you have to move the outhouse. Now I've cut all these planks 45 inches so they'll fit right on the inside of the outhouse. What I'm doing right now is I'm laying them all into position just so I've got a temporary platform to work off of while I build the seat area of the outhouse. Now whenever I touch something you can see it move. The building at this point is incredibly flimsy because it's just light plywood and 2x2 framing members. But once everything has been put together and each part of the outhouse is screwed in solid to the adjoining part of the outhouse, it becomes a very rigid building. This is an incredibly efficient way to build. You can tell that this outhouse is not very decorative or artistic. It's a very utilitarian structure, but it's going to be very solid once it's all done. You see here I'm affixing a scrap of the polycarbonate roof material that I'm going to use to the inside of the seat face in the outhouse. Now, this is a pea shield, to be frank. What it does is it keeps the front of the outhouse riser from being soaked with urine, to be blunt. Without this particular piece, that wooden front section will become saturated and it's foul and it makes your outhouse fall apart. That is one of the most critical aspects of an outhouse, is that pea shield. Now here I'm getting measurements to the inside, to the riser, and to that 2x4 nailer. And I'm transferring those measurements to the outside so I can run screws through the outside of the plywood and hit that 2x2 nailer underneath the seat and the riser. That'll make that building nice and rigid. This is one of the most difficult sections to put together. Not because there's a whole lot to it, just because it's a pretty floppy piece of material that we're putting on for the front doorway area. Once I've cut the door out of that area, it's just basically a giant hoop of plywood that's not very sturdy. Once I get that screwed in there, it'll help out, make everything square up and get rigid. Now, our property in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is down a dead-end road, down another dead-end road, and down another dead-end road, and at the end of a goat trail. We're 8 miles from the nearest power pole and probably 20 miles from the nearest building store. So, I did a lot of the prep work at home before we headed up to the UP this weekend to put up the wall tent and build the outhouse. It's always easier to kind of break a job like this down into the subsections, and as long as you know the dimensions that you want to build the outhouse itself, you can cut individual parts of it and get them ready, and you don't actually have to be on site, so long as you know what you want to build beforehand. I'm cutting the foam section of the seat, very important, not only for comfort, but also warmth in the wintertime. You sit down on a piece of foam like this and it's immediately warm. Anything other than foam, like a hard plastic toilet seat, is just murder once it's cold. Check the fit, all good. Now I'm going to throw on the roof panels. And one thing you'll notice is that there really isn't much roof framing on this outhouse. Well, this is big snow country, and I'm going to have to really reinforce the underside of this roof. I'll probably put a 2x4 about every 6 or 8 inches, but I don't have to worry about that until November. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tack this in place. I'll put one more brace in the center and call it good for now. Now that the toilet seat riser area has been screwed in through the walls, so it's solid and rigid, now I can build the floor on the inside of the outhouse to the dimensions that actually exist. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this board that's going to be the farthest out, and I'm going to scribe fit it into the corner, cutting out an area for that 2x2, cutting out a little strip for that plywood face. What I want to do is I want to get that board so it fits in there perfectly. And then what that will do is it'll leave me a gap. I don't know what it's going to be. It might be 2.5 inches, might be 3.5 inches. We'll find out afterwards. And then I'll cut a very thin piece of board to fit in that gap. What I'm doing here is I'm cutting out a little tiny strip for that plywood door face. And you can see in the background there, I've cut out a section for that 2x2 framing member that's in the corner. I like to finish these cuts with a handsaw. That way you're not running the cut way past the corner. You run it right to the corner. That handsaw will just trim up the very last little bit of wood that needs to come out of that cut. I think we're just about there. Let's take this board over and see how our measurements panned out. Oh, fits perfect. Let's screw that sucker down. Now I'll get a read on what that gap is that's left and cut a piece of wood to fill that gap. From here you can do the rest of the job pretty much with your eyes shut. Once that little piece of board goes into that gap and is screwed down, everything else can just get screwed off. All the planks that are inside the outhouse, all the planks that are out front of the outhouse, they can all get screwed down tight and you've got a good solid floor. The only issue I have is that some of these boards are not as solid as others. I have some boards here that are made out of oak. I have some boards made out of cherry, and there's one or two that are made out of pine. I basically just used whatever I had. So I'm going to take this extra board and screw it in from underneath to kind of bridge all of those pieces of plank so that the ones that aren't quite as solid, they're going to be attached to their neighbor, and it's going to help make the floor feel much, much stiffer. Now it's just a job of running the screws in, and you're done. Now, of course, the inside of the outhouse needs a floor, but you also need this porch area out front, so that when you walk up to the outhouse and you open the door, you can walk comfortably into the outhouse without stepping over a void or something like that. It just makes it much more user-friendly. Well, let's check the floor. That seems good and rigid. Now let's move on to installing the outhouse door. Now, installing a door like this that's flimsy plywood, it could be incredibly frustrating. The door needs to be lifted up because I've cut it a bit short, and you're going to have to screw a screw through the hinge into that flimsy door. So we need to kind of engineer this site so it's very conducive to working by yourself. I'm going to take these scraps of wood and screw them to the back side of the doorway. So when I set the door in place, it's going to kind of set flat against those boards, and it's not going to push in when I screw the hinges to the door. But I also need a way to lift that door up. I'll just use my axe. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to take the axe, stick it underneath the door panel, set the door in place, and you'll notice that once the door is set firmly in place, it's setting up against those boards, and it's ready to be screwed to the hinges. It's got that gap across the top. I'll just tap in the axe, raise that door right up into place, run some screws into the hinges, and before you know it, we'll have this job done. Now we need to give this door something to stop against. So when you push it closed, it doesn't just fold up inside the outhouse. So I'm going to take a couple blocks of 2x4 and just screw them in the corners. So when you shut the door, it's got something to shut against.
Now we're to a wonderful point in the process. We're to the point where basically all the hard work is done. All that's really left is to put a good handle on the door. Let's do it. This 90-degree chunk of branch, I think that's going to work good. I'm just going to take the chainsaw, put a nice parallel cut across there, make a good handle. Let's go try that out. I think that'll work just fine.
Every outhouse needs some kind of a lock. So when you step into the outhouse, you can shut the door and you can lock it so no one else barges in on you, and you, of course, keeps the door closed so you don't have to hold it yourself. I'm just going to use this chunk of maple that came off of the beams from underneath the floor. I cut a little chunk off what was left. We'll use that as our lock.
Last but not least, let's talk about the 3 tips that you need to know to make your outhouse way better than the other guy's outhouse. Very simple things that need to be done, but it's going to make all the difference in the world. Number 1, you want a clear roof. Now, polycarbonate roof panels like this, they're going to let in all the light. When it's dim outside, you're going to be able to see just fine. Now, you don't have to have clear roof panels. You can have anything you want. But what you do need is you need some natural light in there so that you can see as well as possible. If you just put on a solid roof and you have solid walls and you have tight joints, you can build yourself a box that's about pitch dark in the middle of the daytime, and that's not what you want. So whether it's translucent green, whether it's translucent white, or whether it's a clear panel like you see here, use some kind of roofing that's going to let the light in. Number 2, don't put toilet paper in an outhouse. Number 2, very, very, very important point. All that toilet paper that you put down the hole is going to fill your outhouse up in about half the time it would otherwise. It's not going to break down the same as everything else that's in the outhouse. It's just going to accumulate much, much faster. And this is not a Forest Service outhouse. Nobody's going to be buying a week to pump it. So keep your toilet paper out of the outhouse. What you want to do is put a paper grocery bag in the outhouse. Take your paper and throw it in the paper grocery bag. When it's full, burn it. And then it's gone. It doesn't go in the hole. It doesn't plug up your outhouse. You know, this is not a vault system. This is an old school outhouse. Whatever goes down there is probably not going to be coming out. So you want it to last as long as possible. Burn your paper, put it in a paper bag, don't put it in the hole. Number 3, if you look down inside the hole here, you're going to see there's a polycarbonate panel stapled to the front of this outhouse area. The reason being is when you pee, you're going to be peeing on the polycarbonate. It's going to slide down and drip off, and it's not going to soak into the wood. Lots of outhouses out there have skipped this, have neglected it, or didn't know about it in the first place, and they reek. And they're destroying themselves. This whole wooden front area is going to just get saturated with urine over time, and it's not only going to get destroyed, it's going to be rancid. So when you buy the roofing that's going to go on your outhouse, make sure you've got enough left to make a splash guard pea shield that's going to go right in here on the inside of this wooden face. Those 3 things are going to let everybody know that you're an outhouse pro. That your outhouse is better than the next guy's outhouse. That your stuff don't stink. Well, there you have it. There's the outhouse from the ground up. From the hole to the roof. As it is with any camp or any cottage or any homestead, this is the most important building. It's got to go up first. And this is one way to do it. Thank you guys so much for watching Bush Radical. My name's Dave Whipple. Be radical, eh? See you soon.